you're a strong man, you think you're a tough guy, you go to one of these theaters, a diminutive Japanese man doing acrobatics apparently, and you say, hey you, let's fight. I've got 10 heis here with your name on it if you can throw me. What were the rules of these bouts?
So if the challenger came along, they would make them wear a gi. The gi was important. They did not like to take their gis off. Sometimes they did. They could agree on no gi rules, but for the most part, the Japanese would lend you a jacket and then they'd go at it, right? I imagine like 90% of people that walked in there would not be a challenge, you know. Like I think every now and then you'd find a tough man that probably made them work, but this is all speculation, right? Like this is what we know of under fighting in general. Maeda, from all accounts, was skilled. Like that seems to be clear. Like he wasn't a phony. Like he was a legit fighter. It's just that, you know, it's not likely that people would accept the challenge, especially then. People would have been terrified. I think my suspicion, and it's all speculation here, is that they had it coordinated in the circus. They had coordinated in the crowd. I'm like, hey, by the way, you're going to challenge me, okay? Act tough, and to sell, to make it more entertaining to the public. Because I think it's highly unlikely that someone in early 20th century, the people that had no idea how to fight them. Everyone knows how to have an idea of what a jab and the right hand is these days. Everyone like has an idea what a choke is. Like then, these are all alien concepts. Like have no idea what a street fight would have looked like. It would have been really ugly, imagine, because people, man, just you see two people that don't know how to fight. It's terrible. It's horrible to watch. You know, but even someone who plays video games and watch movies has an understanding of what to do. They'll try to kick, they'll try to throw a punch and keep their hands up, right? They have a fun, even from watching, have like an understanding of what they're supposed to do. But then they wouldn't have had that. I think it's highly unlikely that someone would have stepped out of the crowd to challenge them. I think it was all staged. I think it's far more likely that it was a friend or someone they agreed on and like, hey, by the way, you're going to challenge me, we're going to fight. You know, these fake fights play a much bigger role in the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA than people think. It's just not something like we think pro wrestling is something, you know, like pro wrestling was huge. That helped finance these guys' lives. They couldn't pay the bills. They had to be the fake fight. So pro wrestling was paying the bills. Teaching class was hard. People weren't that interested. I mean, there was some interest, but like nothing compared to what it is today, where you can have a school and be fine. If you wanted to get by, you had to do what you had to do. So you can't even blame these men for doing what they did. The public just didn't understand fighting.
Okay, fascinating. I mean, it makes perfect sense as you explain it. But I would feel like if I removed that line from context, you'd just be like breaking hearts everywhere.
Yeah, and it's because we idealize the past, right? The past is noble. You know, the past is sort of this idealized place where everything was perfect. You know, it's memories. And memories are often, you know, like we cherish our childhood memories. You know, we like to remember the past. In my days, things were so much better. You know, you know, and it's one thing that I never liked. I've always been like one of my favorite books of all time is Howard Zinn, the People's History of the United States.
Yes, great one.
Because Howard Zinn it's such an important chord that history often ignores. Everyone remembers George Washington. No one remembers the militias, right? When we know for a fact that the militias were doing most of the winning, and George Washington was not doing great against the British. Like the British were all do with him in European-style formations. Militias would hit and run, and they were causing a lot of damage to the British, right? But no one remembers them, even though they were fundamental in the war, right? So like these, I've always had like a soft place in my heart for like the underdogs, and that's part of the motivation for this film, but also for the human side of characters. I never like to idealize. Like when people like to try to portray, you know, Carlos and Helio as like these saintly creatures, like they're such great people and grand masters. I'm like, I don't like that. I don't like Jigoro Kano being like that. I like the human side. So when we were in Belém do Pará, we're talking to a man who's responsible for he's the president of the Japanese Amazonian Association. Can't remember the exact title, right? But he's an important Japanese in the community. And he knew a lot of people who knew Maeda, old timers who knew Maeda personally. And he's telling us stories of Maeda. And he's like a womanizer, and he liked to drink, and he was a gambler. You know, and he get really mad when he gambled and he lost. He lose his mind apparently. Like he just lost his shit if he lost a cards game. And he liked to dress nice. Like he was always well dressed. Like it was very important, and he was very friendly. He's very nice, very charismatic. But he liked to drink and liked to party, and he was a womanizer. You know, and that's when I was like, I liked him more. I didn't like him less. It didn't break my heart. It was more like, he's human. Thank you. Like I hate we're not angels, right? Like no one. This view that, oh man, that person right there, yeah, they're different. You know, I think Dostoevsky once wrote that if you want to love a man, you have to see him from far away. If you see him up close, you're going to lose your love for him. Because, and I see what he's saying, but like, to me, like it should be the opposite. You know, like we should like people more once they show their humanity and their flaws, because it should remind them of ourselves. But I think people need heroes. Like people enjoy that. You know, Maeda was this incredible fighter. He never did anything wrong, and he was so noble, and so was Carlos. And then once you look at their biography, it's like, no, they were people, and they messed up all the time, and they lied, and they cheated, and they did all kinds of horrible things. But it doesn't mean they didn't important. It doesn't mean that they didn't play a role in history. It just means that they weren't perfect.
Exactly. There's a very interesting study about the idea of icons and how people turn into icons, and then we might attach certain virtues to those icons and just ignore the person for who they were. So like, you know, this happened to Gandhi, this happened to Jesus, this happened to Che. And, you know, it's very interesting. You know, we're kind of deifying Maeda and Carlos and Elio posthumously.
Yeah, it's sad because, you know, I think it corrupts the present and the future. Like you have to understand the past in an honest way. I'm an advocate of history being the most important discipline. No one agrees with me, but I think it's the most important of all disciplines because, you know, people that doesn't understand their past has no idea who they are and has no idea what their future is. Like you have to have an identity and understanding of things is important. And then for you to understand history, you have to be honest about it, you know, and that means removing the BS. Oh no, it's better that we bullshit people. Let's tell people these people are all saints, you know, and they're great people, so they have someone to look up to. And I just never liked that approach. I don't think it's healthy. I think it's better if we show that people are flawed so we can see ourselves in them. Like, it doesn't mean that you lose your north, that, you know, it's like, oh, it's okay to be, you know, a scumbag because other people were. Like, I don't think that's a justification. I don't think those people would look at it that way. But you're right about the characters you mentioned. These people they get glorified and throughout history. And once you look at their biographies, it's not always pretty. And that doesn't mean they didn't play a role. Like, you know, it doesn't mean just because George Washington, like, wasn't winning battles and the militias were doing the most damage to the British, it doesn't mean he wasn't important. It didn't mean that he didn't like murder the Iroquois as well, you know, and that he was killing loyalists at it, you know, but he was still like Carlos, like all these characters, they are important. It doesn't mean they're angels. Like Carlos, I refer to him as like, he was the Dana White of Jiu-Jitsu. What did he invent an art? Was he a great fighter? Like, no, but would we have the UFC today without Dana White? Would the UFC be where it is today without Dana White? I think it's highly improbable. I don't think that, I mean, the UFC, if not Dana White, then someone like him, it was necessary to put the UFC where it was. It's the same with Carlos Gracie. But I don't think Carlos Gracie invented anything, or he was a great fighter for that matter. He has one fight that we know of, and he lost. Then he has 2 fake matches with Joe Mori. And then he has a demonstration with Joe Mori. And he has a match with Samuel Capoeira that Hala mentions in her biography, but there are no records of that match, so we don't really know if it happened. But
okay, let's rewind here. Okay, so so when was the first jiu-jitsu versus jiu-jitsu match in Brazilian history?
Jiu-jitsu versus jiu-jitsu?
Yeah. Does Gio Mori count as jiu-jitsu or judo?
He's Kodokan. You remember the term?
Oh, he's Kodokan.
Judo. Yeah, they're used interchangeably, right? It's like no-gi and submission wrestling today. It's the same thing. Like, it's grappling and no-gi. Like, we don't really draw a distinction. Like, later these terms becoming different things. But at the time, Maeda using the term jiu-jitsu. I've never seen Maeda use the term judo. But he's a Kodokan man. He was teaching judo. But he called it jiu-jitsu because when he left Japan, that's what he called it. So he kept calling jiu-jitsu his whole life. He never really changed. That's why, like, Brazilians insist on calling it jiu-jitsu, is possibly because that. Joe Mori, too. I've never seen Joe Mori referred to as judo. You know, they were calling it jiu-jitsu because when they left Japan, that's what they called it, right? So, your question about Gio Mori? What's your question again? Sorry.
When was the first jiu-jitsu judo match that occurred in Brazil?
That's a good question, man. I know we know Sada Miyako made it to Brazil, 1908. He has a match with a Capoeira, I believe, in 1909. He gets knocked out. So the first time Jiu-Jitsu makes its presence in Brazil, we're getting our butts kicked by Capoeira. He got knocked out. which seems to be like a Vale-Tudo fight because if the kicks were allowed, I'm not sure exactly what the rules were, but it seemed to have been like an MMA fight, right? But we don't know exactly what the rules of engagement were. That's an interesting question. I'm trying to think here. We know that the Oscar Gracie Donato Pitti that took place in 1921, I believe. But there were others. There have been others before that. I'm trying to think if Sada Miyako fought someone else. We know that Carlos had a demonstration with Joe Mori in 1929. And then Oscar Donato in 1921. It's a good question, man. I never thought the very first judo / jiu-jitsu match in Brazil. I'd have to do some digging, man. Like, it might be one of those things and I see it and I go, oh yeah, that was that one. But off the top of my head, I really can't remember, and I don't want to be wrong.
No worries. So how about this? What I'm trying to get the core of the question is, what rules were used in those matches?
Same thing as I suspect in Japan. I really don't know that period that well, so I don't read Japanese. I'm suspicious of everything that's online. It's not something I spent a lot of time researching. So my guess, it was like they were in Brazil. We know Japan. I suspect that they were wing, and in Brazil we know this because there's tons of arguments in the press. Like the biggest issue was the length of the gis. And what's interesting, I think it's like Pedrera. Like he sarcastically he makes a comment in one of his books. He goes like, the Gracies were more Japanese than the Japanese because they wanted the gis on at all time, and the Japanese were down to grapple without the gi more than the Gracie brothers were. Interesting. But they liked the jacket, but not the short. With the short sleeves. When they went to Japanese, they wanted the short sleeves. They not want the long sleeves. And early in the 20th century, short sleeves was the norm. But later that changes. You can look at as judo becomes more organized, the long sleeves become the norm, and the Japanese all want long sleeves, and the Gracies, like Helio doesn't want like long sleeves. The Carlos like adamant, little short sleeves. And later they implement the no point system, right? Because they don't want points, right? Because if there are no points, I got a shot at drawing. If we draw, you didn't tap me. If I didn't tap, I didn't really lose. If I didn't really lose, you didn't really win. So it's a moral victory. You start. It's a stretch. I understand, but remember, if you got good marketing, you convince people just about anything. Like just most. I mean, the Helio's losses to Kimura and Valdemar Santana, they're clear losses, but they come across in history as moral victories because Valdemar Santana is heavier, or because Kimura is heavier and he was better, or you spin these things like a draw is a win. We've seen this. We see this still. Like, oh, you didn't tap me, I didn't lose. Right, but they can't agree on the rules. To answer your question, they're constantly arguing. It's a very interesting match, which to me, my opinion, it marks the split between judo and at the beginning of the split. You can see like there's a little crack. There's a little. They begin to splinter off in 1934, 35. I'm horrible with dates, man. I can remember the context much better than the actual dates, but like it's 34.
Okay. Tell me the story.
And between Ono and Helio Gracie, and they can't agree on the rules. And this goes on for weeks. Like they can't agree on the rules. They can't agree, and they finally agree on like long rounds, like 100-minute fight total, something like 100 minutes, but no points. So they fight to a draw. Like Ono took Helio down 32 times, and then they fight again. It's a draw, right? No points. The second time they fought, Ono took Helio down 27 times. It's also a draw. Right, and Ono wants points because this is BS. Like I can't open your guard, and you defend yourself well, and like I'm clearly winning the fight, but it's a draw. And then in the press, you got to remember, Carlos was a shrewd PR genius, man. Like that was his superpower. It wasn't jiu-jitsu, it was PR. Like he just made it sound like Helio won, and like that drove people crazy. They had a lot of enemies because of that. They were not very liked people because like these people are full of it. Like you clearly lost. Always a draw. So when Helio challenged him a third time, this time with points, Helio wouldn't fight him. You don't want to hear from him. You can see he suggested that Ono fight his years later, right? Like fight Carlson instead. But basically, like they didn't like the points because it's not something that they could beat the Japanese at. So remember, like if I can't beat you at something, and I really want to beat you, but I can't beat you, what I do is I modify the rules to maybe possibly beat you. If I have to modify things to make it more, more probable for me to beat you, or at least draw. Because if I draw, I didn't really lose, right? And that to me marks the beginning of the split, because you can see it's clear that they can no longer agree on the rules. You know, it becomes an issue, and becomes an issue. And you know, the Gracie family, for, you know, for better or for worse, they were very shrewd at manipulating things to their favor. Like if they couldn't beat someone, they'd find a way to, you know, fight them in the way that they could, you know, that would suit them, and it would, you know, draw. And then they make a draw. Like when he loses to Kimura, they called it a moral victory. You know, he lost. He got smashed by Kimura. Mm-hmm. But they call it a moral victory. And that's how in the history books, that's how it was recorded. It's been recorded as a moral victory. Yeah.
Bizarre. So we kind of ran over something. When you say points, you mean judo rules.
Correct. I mean, honestly, I don't know this. I don't know what the rules were. What we do know is they were, I mean, that's what they referred to as points. They want points in place. They want the internationally accepted rules. Like that's what they want, the traditional judo rules. The rules you guys are coming up with don't exist anywhere. That's basically their argument, right? This is not something that the world is practicing. You guys are doing it differently. And Carlos and he are like, no, we don't care. We're going to do it this way. You know, and they instead, in Japanese, Ono is like, he wants a piece of Helio so bad that he just like finally accepts like Helio's conditions. He's like, I just want to kill this guy. You know? It was a huge rivalry at the time. Like it was very, when Helio fights Kimura, Ono is there training Kimura, like, you know, they're helping him train, because it's, you know, there's an element of rivalry at that point between Brazilians and Japanese and judo, and the Brazilian version of judo that they went on to call Jujitsu, but it's really judo. But yeah, it's fascinating. Like I mean, at the end of the day, man, if it weren't for that resistance, we would all be doing judo. So, you know, we can like it or dislike their methods. They got us here.
It's very true. I wanted to share a theory I have about the historical thought as a meme, the idea that this rule set was actually planted within them, and they kind of continued it even as a tradition. So as I was saying, in the 1880s, when the Totsuka Ryu and Kodokan had their rivalry, they were using a rule set that was very bare bones. Submission or the guy loses consciousness. That's the only way to win.
Yeah.
So when you have Maeda moving to Brazil and teaching jiu-jitsu, I feel like he had an inclination towards that. He was just saying, you know, that's what jiu-jitsu is. And, you know, that thing that, you know, Kano Sensei made up in the 1890s, you know, that's him like adding his touch, like putting a stamp on it. But that's not real jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
So then he moves to Brazil, and then he teaches jiu-jitsu as he always knew it as a kid, which was submission or unconsciousness is how you win. And then as he teaches that to any number of students, that kind of sticks with them, and they think of that as jiu-jitsu, and then, you know, kind of other rules as impositions within that or onto that.
I mean, look, I don't know. I wish I were more familiar with like what Kodokan was like during that period, because Kodokan, it's changing. It wasn't like it has a canon, and it has like a central, you know, like a set of techniques, but I think that we know that the rules were changing over time. Like things were eliminated over time, like wrist locks and shoulder locks, right? Later they eliminated the double leg, right? Mototegari, and then the single. I don't know exactly what Maeda was. We know that Maeda was influenced by other styles, like catch wrestling, for example, and his experience was a broader one than the average judoka because he had traveled so much. And when you're traveling the circus, you're meeting up with all these other fighters, you know, you're probably absorbing a lot from them as well, you know. There's a Brazilian historian that we interviewed, and he has a theory that the guard was a reaction to like fighting these wrestlers. Right, because they're fighting these wrestlers in the circus and they can't beat them, so they start developing the ground a fight that's a different style. It's like, I can't take you down, but I'll fight you on the ground. very much like today. Like if you can't take the wrestler down, you get up on the ground, you play guard with them because you got a shot at beating them there. So that's his theory, his thesis, right? Would be that you just develop as a reaction to the fact that they couldn't take wrestlers down. It might have been influenced by that. I don't know. As far as like, I suspect it's not the case. I'll tell you why. And this is interesting. I should, because it doesn't make it to the documentary. It's not, but more out of curiosity, I should probably look into this more. It might be in Craze. I read it when it came out about over a year ago. So rereading it might be able to clarify this. But I think that, Maeda there were too many Japanese visiting Maeda. Remember, like Japanese is known. So like Takeo Yano, he comes to Brazil much later, right? I believe in the late 1920s, he makes it to Brazil. And he visits Maeda in the Amazon, right? And he stays with Maeda during a period. And he would have been updated in Maeda on like what the rule sets were and like what had changed in judo. He would have been like a fresh body from Japan because Maeda never goes back to Japan. He just never returns. I don't know. I know that the Kodokan rule set became very, very sport oriented, very aimed at. They argue, like Jigoro Kano argued, for self-defense purposes. And, I think that if you claim, it's a horrible argument if you ask me, because throwing someone is grabbing, if you're going to fight multiple attackers, right, grabbing them and throwing them is not the best form of self-defense. Neither is taking them to the ground. It's hitting and running, right? Like, you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. Like, you hit and run. And in boxing would be the best style if you're going to fight multiple opponents. That's my thing. I wouldn't kick either. I wouldn't try to throw it. I wouldn't try to take you down. I'd hit, bob and weave, hit, run. That would be the ultimate style. But, Yogoro Kano is insistent on like, oh, this is for multiple opponents. You don't want to take someone down in against multiple opponents, which is true. But, I still don't think that they really understood grappling to a large extent. Like, I think that Jigoro Kano, at least, he's, you're not a good grappler if you want to, you don't know much about grappling if you want to eliminate the ground. It's to me, it's that simple. Like, how can why would you eliminate something if you understand how important it is? It's like he just didn't understand the importance, or maybe he felt it wasn't necessary, or like he compared the ground to like animals crawl, right? Those are the words he used. Animals are crawling, humans walk upright. So he thinks the ground is somewhere that's not fit for the martial art that he wanted to create. Whatever the case, it was a huge mistake. As far as what Maeda and these men are practicing in Brazil, I'm not sure, because later Helio accepts the points. Helio doesn't like points when he's fighting. Later he accepts them. So like the Guanabara Federation, I know you want to talk about that. Like, yeah. It's a very decisive, it's a second decisive movement that we can recognize. Other than the Ono fight, is the Guanabara Federation 67, where they implement points. And Helio is at the forefront of it. Helio is like spearheading this federation, and they have points in there. It's the basis for IBJJF rule set. So I don't think that Gracies were more submission oriented and not point oriented. I think they just couldn't beat the Japanese at it, so they carved a style where they had a chance at winning. That's
the most pessimistic view you could take.
The most what?
The most pessimistic view you could take on it, right? I think it's
true.
I think it's,
yeah. That's. What are their motivations? Like, you're talking about their motivations. It's a speculation, of course, but you can see that they don't like. They don't want to lose, and they know if they apply points to the fight, they're going to get killed by the Japanese. There's no way. He got taken down 32 times.
Crazy.
32 times in a fight.
His break falling must be on point.
And I think Helio took him down once, to be fair. But it's like, and it was clear that he was not going to win. Right? And the Japanese know this. So they're like, that's why the rules were such like was no man's land, right? The fight was taking place. They're constantly arguing over like what rule set they're going to fight under.
Around in the early 20s, also they start developing Kosen Judo rules too for schools and high schools and colleges. Did you do any research into that?
Very little. We spoke to Kosen Judo. I didn't get into their history at all. But we know that the Niwaza, the sophisticated Niwaza that existed in Japan, and I suspect there were a lot of practitioners and maybe even competitions during this period, and it was all high level, because this is the practitioner speaking, the coach, right? You don't reach a conclusion of a De La Riva and an X guard unless you spend thousands of hours on the mats and competitive rounds. highly competitive rounds. If you just cruising on the mats and rolling every now and then, you don't reach any conclusions. For you to reach a conclusion of a De La Riva and an X guard, you spend a lot of time training, man. Like a lot of time, like thousands. It's competitive rounds, because those are advanced techniques. Like they're not simple techniques. A rear naked choke is a simple technique. A Kimura is a fairly simple technique. A De La Riva sweep is not a simple technique. It's not something you can just like, come up with, unless you have a lot of time grappling. So the Kosen judokas, undoubtedly, they're very sophisticated. What's interesting is that it kind of dies out. Like the Kodokan, like they're steamrolling through every other style in Japan. For some reason, they still call it judo. So they kept an affiliation with Kodokan, and it's a loose affiliation. I think Viera compared it to like collecting baseball cards. It's a curiosity. It's not really, it doesn't play a big role in more Japanese, the martial arts psyche in Japan. Like it's a curiosity. Like some high school kids and university kids want to grapple and roll around and let them do it. But it was a very rich tradition. It has some very sophisticated techniques. And the reason why we wanted to we visited the Tokyo and Kyoto universities. And it was because we wanted to show that, in fact, Brazilians didn't revolutionize the ground. What Brazilians had done was survive the onslaught of judo. Because judo is like, once again, it's steam rolling through all the other styles, not just Japan, but later in the world. Everyone's being absorbed by Kodokan. And in Brazil, they resisted. But the Kosen chapter in our documentary is important because we wanted to show that, wait a second here. The Brazilians were not ahead of the Japanese here. Well, let's be fair. And like some of my Brazilian friends get mad at me because it sounds like I'm diminishing the role of Brazil. And it's not the case. It's just that this is my challenge to everyone who believes that Brazilians revolutionized the ground. Show me anything that the Brazilians were doing in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s that isn't in any Kosen Judo book. Show me one thing. And you're not going to find it because there isn't, right? Brazilians really, this is the third moment after the Guanabara Federation of 67. The third moment is a CBJJ/IBJJF being founded in 94. From that point onwards, Brazilians take the lead. From that point onwards, like Jujitsu, the ground techniques become far more sophisticated in Brazil than they were in Japan. To the point where today, the Kosen students, their references and idols are people like Leandro Lowe and Rafael Mendes. Like those are the people they look up to. Like they know all about the BJJ competition scene. So like just to give an idea of how like even the Japanese acknowledge, okay, like what you guys are doing is more, has passed what we were, but the Japanese were way ahead of Brazilians for most of the 20th century.
Fascinating. Just so you know, I'm controlling myself agreeing with you just because I want clean sound bites from you. So I'm going to let you speak as much as you wish so that I can get clean sound bites, and then I'm not going to be muddling up.
No, for sure, man. You do what you got to do, man.
Yeah, just so you know. I want to agree. I'm just like holding my mouth closed. So let's go back. So the 50s passed by. We have some iconic matches there. So like Kato versus Elio and Kimura versus Elio. And then let's fast forward. I mean, are there any like very famous matches within that time? Within a grappling? I know there's some famous Valley 2 matches there too, but.
So actually, Helio fought Kato twice.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, like I don't know that. They fought twice. The first time was a draw, and a lot of draws, because of the points. It's like, that's what's going to happen, A lot of draw, and then the second time he chokes him, right? But that's like the Kimura moment is a bit of a comeback for the Gracie families. At that point, it was dying out. Like Jiu-Jitsu had its moment in Brazil in the 1920s, little 30s, big in the 30s, 40s, and then it's slowing down. So by the time that Kimura makes it to Brazil, Judo's already taken over. But Carlos and Helio are shrewd. They're very great, especially Carlos, very intelligent marketeer. And he goes like, well, let's challenge these guys. Let's put our name back in the press because they were disappearing from the press. So they have a comeback and they have their big moment, arguably their biggest moment in the Maracanã Stadium, right? I believe the Brazilian president at the time was there watching, or the vice president. I can't remember now. And it was a big moment for them. Like, it's just being able to go against Kimura was a huge privilege. You know, Kimura was known as a Japanese champion. He's not that famous in Japan, ironically. When I hear, like, in Japan, everyone thinks of him as a pro wrestler because he becomes a pro wrestler later in his career. But, like, he's not a famous judoka. But, you know, that's not how he was marketed in Brazil. In Brazil, he was marketed as the champion of the world and the greatest Japanese fighter ever. So it was a big moment for the Gracie family. But, like, after that, it dies out. Like, jiu-jitsu disappears from the press. It's not like 60s, 70s, 80s. Brazilians are trying to mimic judo. And that's what the Guanabara Federation of '67 comes about. They're trying to follow in the footsteps of judo with tournaments, belt ranks. That's when the black belt jiu-jitsu comes about. Up to then, they weren't even wearing black belts. They were a navy blue belt, you know, and they next thing you know, they're wearing red belts, you know, but they all promoted themselves because there's no one to promote them. But, like, they're following in judo's footsteps, right? They want to be judo, but they don't want to be judo. You know, like, they because they want to be the leaders of a movement. Like Carlos and Hilo, they see themselves as leaders of a movement. You know, you got to, for better or for worse, you know, that their ambition played a role. You know, I can't see Helio going under the Kodokan rule set. I just can't see it. They just wouldn't be absorbed. They just refuse to. But they died. I mean, you don't hear from them in the 70s. Like, it's probably judo and pro wrestling are the big things. Carlson Gracie kind of keeps the family's name relevant for a long period. Like, the Gracie family has always had that they have a champion, George, and then they had Helio, and then they had Carlson, and then they had Holson. There's always, like, someone in the family, later Rickson, right? And they always had someone, okay, this person is going to carry on the legacy of the family. And I mean, they have so many kids that, yeah, it's not surprising. But that BJJ, I mean, no one called it BJJ in Brazil for the same reason no one calls Chinese food in China. It's just food, you know. The term Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a term of the 90s. Like, the word just Brazilian and Jiu-Jitsu were never used together in Brazil. It still isn't. But you know, like, it's practically dead. Like, it's very few practitioners, small tournaments. I mean, just to give you an idea, I grew up in Brazil. I didn't hear about jiu-jitsu until Royce Gracie. I had never heard of jiu-jitsu. And I grew up in Brazil. It was not a mainstream sport. Like, I knew taekwondo, I knew karate, I knew judo, I knew kung fu, I knew what they were. But I had no clue that there was a family of Brazilians practicing jiu-jitsu in Rio de Janeiro. And I didn't hear about that until Royce Gracie. So, you know, it's the revival of the 90s is very important. Like, that was their comeback, you know, but they disappeared from the press for like 30, 40 years.
Okay. So 1967 rolls around. So the Guanabara Federation decides they want to emulate judo, at least in having a rule set. And what is the rule set that they decide upon?
Actually funny because, like, I knew that there was the basis for IBJJF, and but I never seen the rule set, and I finally got a copy of the rule set of their manual, right? You'd be surprised, like, how much they took from judo, even like the ethics of the ground and like the educational part and, you know, respect and code of honor. Like, they took a lot from judo. They borrowed a lot from judo. But what is different is the prestige, because they insisted on calling it jiu-jitsu. They would never have the prestige that judo had. You know, judo was the MMA of its time. It was the Brazilian jiu-jitsu of its time. It was very popular. Interesting. Like, many people that weren't Kodokan became Kodokan because it was so prestigious. Interesting. In the 90s, we had the opposite movement. We have all these judokas become Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belts all of a sudden because it was more prestigious to be a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt because it was in vogue. Right, so essentially, we have, like, you see the opposite movement that took place in the 50s, 60s. We see the opposite take place in the 90s. But what's interesting about the Guanabara Federation is that it's less similar to IBJJF Ruleset than I thought it would be. It is I thought I was going to see a lot more similarities. It's not that similar, but there's a point there for mount, point for sweep, a point for the back, point for takedown. What else? I believe there are no advantages. They're basically, from memory, like, I have it, or I can pull it. I can send it to you later. It's a point for every position, right? I can't remember if Neon Belly is there. And but they start standing.
I wanted to. Yeah, it's not there, and I'll mention that to you later. I think that was actually added in the early 2000s.
The Neon Belly?
Yes.
So what's interesting about the Neon Belly, it's the only position that Brazilians actually invented. out of the position, there's like the structural positions like mount, back, you know, close guard, because it's the only one that's in no judo book. I've never seen knee on belly in the judo book. It maybe exists. I've never seen it. I don't think it's in the judo curriculum or even in the Kosen curriculum. Frankly, I don't think that much of knee on belly. This is what I think it's a very overrated position as far as control. It's a good transition, but it's not good control. Kind of like a leg drag. A leg drag is great transition. A leg drag is not good control.
I always thought it was interesting in Seattle, at least, like they didn't, like the biggest tournament around was called the Revolution. And then they were holdouts. Like they did not have knee on belly or advantage points until like, you know, a few years ago, basically. And I remember thinking like, I don't like knee on belly being 2 points. Like I think like you have mount, you have side control.
You know what's you know how it's overrated. I'll prove to you. It's out of all points at tournaments, the one that is scored the least amount of times is knee on belly. So what does that tell you about its efficiency? Right, it's the least scored point. Like every other point in the rule set is scored more often than knee on belly. So it's because people aren't looking for it other than to just score 2 points when your opponent's dead tired. You pass his guard, he's got nothing left in the tank, you score an extra 2. But no one's using it for control, right? So this is what I've heard. I don't know if this is true. It could be, you know, like urban myth. But the knee on belly came as a result of people fighting, like when they it was a self-defense approach, right? You put the knee on belly to drop punches, because if you're fighting on concrete, it hurts your knees because your knees are on concrete. So you want to have a little more height for better punches and not have your knees on concrete. So you would place the knee on belly and drop punches. It was self-defense theory that was assimilated into the BJJ rule set. I don't know if this is true. I don't know. I can't confirm it, but like I think it's plausible, right? Like if I want more height for better punch, again, assuming we're not talking the UFC here, we're talking people that are clueless. Against a clueless opponent, that would work. Against a skilled opponent, there's a reason why you don't see it in the UFC, because it's not that efficient of a control, right? I've never seen a knee on belly in the UFC. But if you were fighting,
I can think of one guy that did it all the time.
Who?
Cain Velasquez.
Oh, that's right. That's right. But I think people were rocked though. He wasn't like, I think they were already hurt by the time he did it, right? Like he wasn't setting up the. I can't remember. I could be wrong here. Like maybe you're right, but like it's not a very common position.
Yes.
I do think it's overrated, man. Like people get mad when I say, like, dude, like do it then. Like do it to me. See how long you can hold me there. And you're like, oh, but you're heavier. Okay, put someone heavier than me. See if they can hold me there. They can hold me in side control. You put a big, heavy guy on top of me in side control, north-south, he'll hold me down. It's hard to escape, man. You know, knee on belly, like, I don't care how heavy you are. You're not going to hold it down. You know, I can't hold small guys in the end unless they're tired. There's too much freedom for you to move. It's a move that works well if your opponent is gassed out and if you're a lot heavier. That's about it. I think it's the least important out of all the positions.
Interesting. With knee on belly, you have to have your spine fully extended, right? Like you can't be too close to the guy, right?
They've changed that. It's glitchy now. Like you can put the knee on the obliques. It doesn't have to be across. Before it used to be shin across the belly, so your knee's on the other side. Now if you just touch the near hip, like you just barely touch, and as long as your knee is not on the ground and the other knee is also off the ground, it's 2 points. So you can barely touch and they're scoring 2. I think they should do that, man. In all honesty, like I've made this case. Like I've asked them to eliminate it. You guys got to eliminate this. Like it doesn't make sense. It's just tradition, and it's just there's kind of like the appendix in your digestive system.
Yeah, right.
It's just part of the evolution. It's just there. It's sitting there. Okay, but it doesn't really serve a purpose. You know?
It's like a souvenir, maybe. Like it like separates it from. Yeah. Okay, so 1 point for mount, 1 point for back control, 1 point for a takedown, 1 point for passing.
I believe so. From my memory, it's all 1 point. Everything was 1 point, and yeah, it was. But you can see, it's not so different from. It's different from judo in the sense that they're rewarding positioning, right? But I think the game changer, right? The big shift away from judo is guard pulling.
Yes, this is something I wanted to talk to you about. Yeah. So I saw footage from the first tournament in Rio de Janeiro in 1973, which was quite large from what I saw, and there was 0 guard pulling. Like it looked a lot like judo.
Yeah, Yeah, and just an idea. When Helio fights Ono in 35, he got taken down 32 times. Well, they're standing back up, obviously, right? Like, I don't care how long the match is. If you get taken 32 down, like you stood back up 32 times, right? So what that tells me is that at least during that period, they weren't that. Helio guard was not his thing. Like, he's standing back up clearly, unless they're going out of bounds and the referee's standing back up. That could have been the case. But if you look at old footage of Helio moving, he moves like a judoka.
Mm-hmm.
He moves like it's judo. Like, you watch him, like, even they just got better at the ground. Because that's where the Japanese were emphasizing less and less. So they decided to get good at something that, the Japanese were not as skilled at. Even so, I don't think they were that particularly skilled on the ground. I mean, I don't see the technique as being very sophisticated. But I think one of the main reasons why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu drifts towards the ground is because of the infrastructure in Brazil, right? If you go to Brazil, like, the infrastructure is very bad. It's very rare that you get big buildings like a warehouse to practice. Like, if you go to a wrestling room here, like any university in the U.S., and it's huge, you're going to have 40 people practicing standing, no problem. It's the same with judo because it has government funding. They're Olympic sports, so there's government investment. Even the private sector is more likely to invest in something if it's Olympic, whereas BJJ has always been like small business owners. So as a result, you have very tight spaces. And if you have 40 people in a tight room, you can't really do stand-up, can you? Unless you have like 38 people sit down and watch and 2 people practice. So the solution to that conundrum is knee wrestling, which is not very pretty, but it's ingrained in the culture. Like, people start on their knees, and that's the only way we learn how to fight. But I suspect it's a reflex of infrastructure in Brazil and the lack of financing and funding and support that Jiu-Jitsu, Jiu-Jitsu never had support in Brazil, other than like the Oscar Santa Marias of the world, and the occasional, successful school. For the most part, it's just like people that are struggling and barely getting by. Till this day, it's like that, in fact.
Oh yeah, I've lived that life. Yeah, I know it. So 1967, 1973. I mean, like, I've seen some of that footage. I mean, I see these kids, grabbing each other. Zero grip fighting. They just kind of grab each other. I noticed that too, also in the Elio and Kimura fight. Like, they just kind of walk up to each other, get a lapel grip and a elbow grip, and then they start going.
Yeah,
like highly ritualized.
It's I mean, that's why I call it Brazilian Judo. Pedreira calls it a sub-style of Kodokan, right? Which I agree with, I think is right, up to 94. And then after that, it's just today, if you watch BJJ today and you watch Judo, there are more similarities between Taekwondo and Karate than there are between BJJ and Judo.
Interesting comparison.
They've drifted too much. Like, I don't see, there's so little Judo left. In the heavyweight divisions, you see the throws. Mm-hmm. But, like, I mean, what do you think would happen, like, if you put the best judoka in the world inside Mike Musumeci's open guard?
Yeah, he gets chewed, yeah.
He get his back taken in seconds, and there's no shame there. It just gives an idea of how different these sports are. These men, an Olympic caliber judoka, would not recognize. He would not understand what Mike is doing. And I'll say why. You know how I say this with confidence? Because I don't understand. I'm like lost half the time I'm watching that. And I do this for a living. And I'm like not too important. I'm fairly successful. I've been a coach. I've been a referee. I've been a team leader. I've lived this jiu-jitsu life, man. I'm watching Mikey and Paul Lumiao, and sometimes I'm like, wait a second, pause, slow down. Like, I have to, because I can barely keep up with them. Now, someone that's not as trained on the ground, like, I guarantee you they have no idea what they're doing. Mm-hmm. Like, how would they? Why would they? It's not part of the rule set. So BJJ and Judo have drifted too far. I mean, at one point, it's a matter of arbitration. Like, what point do you say that this is a new martial art? When do you say that's an important question? Like, what's a new martial art? I mean, didn't Kano create a martial art because he assimilated from other styles? He never created any techniques. But we didn't call it a sub-style of other rules, right? Is it a sub-style of wrestling then? Is it a sub-style of sumo, right? Well, I mean, at what point do you call a martial art a new martial art, like something completely different? At one point, does a submission-only movement become a new martial art? When does that happen? When do they stop calling it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Well, they've already done that. They're already calling it just Jiu-Jitsu. Pretty soon they're going to call it something else. I don't know. But at what point do you have a new martial art? To me, it's the rule set. Once you can no longer agree on the rules, you have a different martial art.
I completely agree with you. So between 1967 and 1994, how did the rules change that you know of? Okay, for example, when did point differentiation happen? So it was 1 point for each position. When does it become 4 points for back control?
I honestly don't know. And it's funny because I've asked IBJJ. I was just on the phone with like their head guy, or the guy who's like responsible for organizing everything. He's really like that. He's not officially the president, but he's like pretty much is. And he doesn't know either. No one knows. No one knows. It's like a question because you got to remember these are very small tournaments in Rio de Janeiro. These are not like they're not massive like they are now. When people are like kind of like making rules as they went, you know. And it was probably someone raised their hand one day and we're like, hey man, why don't we get 4 points for the back? It's the best position. And everyone like, anyone against it? No, okay, write it down. And it was like something very casual. I don't think we put it. I have my doubts. There was a lot of thought into a lot of this. Like reversal. Why reversal is 2 points? I've never heard a good argument for it. Why reversal is good 2 points? Like you were bottom, you're top. Who cares how you got there? You do the same thing, you know. But like I think that there has not been a lot of thought. And then once it becomes tradition and it's kind of like a Frankenstein. You know, it just works. It's got all these Band-Aids on it, you know, and every year they put new Band-Aids on it. But it's structurally, there's a lot of it that doesn't make sense. There's a lot of good things. Right. So, for example, in the past, I've been very critical of the submission-only movement because they removed position completely. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's all about the submission. And I'm like, no, I think submission should be the priority, but it's not all about the submission. Positioning is important. Watch the UFC. I mean, you just mentioned Cain Velasquez. Cain's case in point. I think there are probably more TKOs on the ground than submissions in the UFC. So my point is not that we should, you know, I'm not creating a hierarchy. I mean, if there were a hierarchy, I put submission above it, my personal opinion. But to eliminate position, you're causing a lot of problems. And when you don't reward position, you don't make it, why would you fight for it? Why would you fight for a takedown if you're not being rewarded? So they kind of shot themselves in the foot by trying to correct IBJJF. They just created the opposite problem. They became very unbureaucratic, which is a very nice thing about it. It's very easy to, I mean, how do you referee a submission-only match? Jesus, like you can put like my grandma there, like anyone could do it. Anyone could do it. It's the easy. Like, there's nothing. You just got to stop it when someone gets hurt. You know, like I'd say there's nothing else to it. You know, but at the same time, like, why would you wrestle? If you say, Rob, from now on, you're going to train your students in submission only rule set, no points, right? I'll be like, okay, this is what we're going to do, guys. 0 wrestling. We're getting really good at defending the arm bar, right? Really good at escaping the back, right, for the overtime, and we get really good at leg attacks because it's high reward. Right? And you have to pass the guard. You don't have to sweep. You don't have to control mount. And if someone passes your guard, cross both your arms across your chest. Don't go to your knees. No way we're going to turtle up. This is why you don't see back takes in submission only. And you see so many at ECC because at ECC they turtle up, not to have points scored on them. Whereas submission only makes sense to be on your back. So it's a more defense, because it's a defensive style, which is not self-defense oriented. Because if you did that in a fight, you get killed. So it's important that we keep the positions because top position is important in the fight. We got to eliminate butt scooting in both submission only and IBJJF because that's not real. It might be fun, it might be cool, but it's not real. So we're drifting away from the martial art into the spectrum and to become cool. You know, let's do so it's trendy. And I don't think that's a good north. I don't think trends are good north. I don't think cool is good north. I think the north should be effectiveness, right? Sitting to your butt and fighting for footlocks is not very realistic in a fight. You know, and even though we should incorporate the heel hooks, I actually made that argument yesterday with IBJJF. Like I'm always insistent on them legalizing heel hooks. Before only no gi, now I insist they legalize it in the gi as well because it's easier to defend. It's not harder. It's much harder to heel hook someone in the gi than no gi. But these are my opinions. Of course, people disagree. But sorry, I had to drift it. But like your question about I honestly don't know. Like no one seems to know. Like I've asked every old timer, like you know how this happened? No one seems to know. Even IBJJF guys, like they don't know either. I think that the rules just evolved it like little by little. Like every time they had a tournament, they modify something. And I mean, I'm half Brazilian, so I can say this, but Brazilians are masters at winging shit. Like that's they don't really plan like that far ahead. It's like we're gonna do this way today. Last second they'll change a rule, and then some of them worked and some of them stayed, and some people had a louder voice than others, and they like this more than that, so their opinion prevailed. But I don't think there was that much thought into it, to be honest. I mean, and how could they? You can't foresee problems you've never had. You can foresee problems you've had in the past, but you can't see blind spots that you've never been exposed to before. So evolution it's not a perfect linear process. Evolution goes up and down, left, right, center, back, and it moves all over the place until you finally find something that works. And IBJJF system, for all its flaws, and it has many in my opinion, I mean, we're the fastest growing martial art in the world, so it can't be that bad.
The reason I asked that question is because to me, that's when you have it's the difference between like a chimp and a gorilla, like the idea that they're just barely branching off each other, like in 1967 or so. And then, or, maybe around the Ono match, they're branching off. And in 1967, you're like, okay, this is definitely a different sport. But, there could be some crossover. You could have a judo champion that's a jiu-jitsu champion. But I think like you were saying, as soon as you kind of have a hierarchy and you say, look, back control gives you 4 and mount gives you 4, both of which are foreign concepts to a judoka, I think there's like, all right, this is a human and this is a chimp now, like, no possibility of even recognizing it as the same species.
Yeah. I'd agree.
I mean, so like a lot happens within those, like it's less than 30 years between, 67 and 94. And so in 1994, like, do you have the first rule book from IBJJF?
That I think I have. And you can see it's IBJJF. I mean, from then onwards, little has changed. Some changes, but not a lot. Like the most of what you would recognize as rule set immediately. Like if you would be halfway through it and be like, yeah, IBJJF. I have it somewhere. I have to look.
They had advantages?
I believe so. Can't remember now. I believe so. I think advantages were in place. The advantage was to solve the draw, like too many draws, right? 2-2, 4-4, right? And then instead, it kind of created another problem too, because now people are fighting. This is my suggestion to them. There's a way around that.
Can I just pause you for a second and hold that thought? So you have I'm going to write this down. So you have the advantage idea, yeah?
I believe so. Don't quote me on this one. I hate being wrong, and like I don't remember. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but I believe I have that 94 rule set. From memory, it was virtually identical to IBJJF today, with minor modifications.
Okay. I have one thing to add, because I spoke to a black belt named Dave Meyer, who's a member of the Dirty Dozen, and he had competed in, the Pan Ams or something. I think it was 1998 or something.
Yeah.
And he had said that if in the case of a tie, the person that was on top was the winner.
That's true. I remember that. You know how I remember that? Because when I started training, I started in 98. That was the rule. If the fight is a draw, there were advantages. But if the fight ended in a draw, there was no decision. Whoever was on top won, which I think is a better criteria than the judges.
So there are advantages and this, if you're on top, you win rule.
Yes. I remember when I started training, that was the rule. And I remember like we used that strategy and it got changed later.
Okay. Fascinating. Okay. Go ahead. Your idea.
Is that you eliminate some advantages, not all of them. I actually like this. One thing you can do, this is an easy fix, is you give a point for near submissions or 2 points for near submission. To me, it's mind-boggling that a shitty knee on belly is an advantage, all right? And then, or a shitty takedown or a shitty something is an advantage, and a tight triangle you barely get out of is an advantage. It's not the same. We can't equate the two. Why are we equating it? Like a tight triangle should be worth points and lots of them. Like I like the Budo challenge that Rickson created in 2004 or 4. And, it was 3-to-1 ratio, 3 points for a near submission, 1 point for position. Boom, solved the problem, man. He met in the middle. Like submission only tried to correct the problem. They swung to, kind of like in politics, right? You get like an extremist on one end, the next election, the other extreme wins because people want the opposite of what that guy was, right? So like submission swings all the way the other way, and then they create other problems. Like, guys, like let's reward position but prioritize submission. And that would be the solution. And I've suggested this to them, but it's hard to make changes because at the end of the day, you may call it a Frankenstein, right? If we want to call it that, but it works. Look at her tournaments, 5,000-6,000 competitors. Like it's hard to argue with success. So on their end, you got to be very careful with whatever changes they make, because if you've never had the problem, you don't know what the problem is. The unknowns. You have no idea what's going to happen if you do this. You always think that it's going to solve it. Sometimes you create a bigger one. I think that the point instead of an advantage for submission would establish a hierarchy against people who are winning with bullshit, right? Getting to a half guard and holding, versus the guy who's attacking more submissions would have higher rank there because they're getting awarded a point or two instead of only an advantage, because you can't equate those advantages, in my opinion, right? But we are like almost something is the same thing as an almost submission. It should be.
I mean, this is a bit editorial for me, but I really like the Rickson Gracie challenge. It was Budo challenge.
Yeah, 95. Fuck, I hate when I can't remember dates, man.
Wasn't Jacare in that too? Was he in your bracket?
No, he was. I was in the Shun. I lost to Shunji in the final.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it was me and shit. I beat the guy Kanehara, who was like a Olympic judo world champion, and I fought in the UFC later. And then I lost to Shunji. I'd been stabbed. I fought that tournament. I had a huge cut in my arm. I got into a fight, and I put the guy in a rear naked choke, and he pulled a knife on me. He stabbed my arm. I had like stitches all across my arm. I didn't want to tell the promoters because they didn't want to pull me out. So I went anyway. This is at a time when someone promised you a ticket anywhere. You took it.
Yeah, of course.
A ticket to like Pahrump, Nevada. You take it. It's free. You take it,
So then, okay, so here's kind of something I noticed with that rule set. The criteria for a near submission was sometimes a bit spurious. Like you were like, I'm not sure if I would have called that, man. Like, I think you're calling that a little early. And, sometimes people would be like, get like a half triangle. And I remember, I think I saw like Jacare just like pull guard. Okay, it was -1 for him. And then he just got like 12 points in like 40 seconds or something.
Yeah.
Because you're just like throwing stuff up like a machine gun. And then the rep was like 3-3-3-3-3.
Yeah, and heel hooks were allowed. Heel hooks were allowed in that tournament. There was not a single heel hook, but heel hooks were allowed.
That's fascinating. That's a great case study.
Yeah, and no, we didn't see a single. I mean, no one went for them really because no one knew.
Yeah,
people they weren't skilled at them. But I've been playing around with heel hooks in the gi, and it's harder to finish. It's much harder to finish.
Well, you have the sleeve, right? You have the sleeve to grab onto.
Yeah, it's easy to defend in comparison.
I wonder why that rule set has not been brought back.
Honestly, I'll give you my theory why this is, and this is a bit of a problem. I don't want to sound arrogant when I say this, but I'm just like being frank. Like a lot of these promoters don't know what they're doing. You got to remember, like almost exclusively, people who come up with rules in jiu-jitsu are people that have little or no competition experience, which is crazy when you think about it, because you normally get the rich guy who's a blue belt and he loves jiu-jitsu and he wants to be the alpha dog in the room. So he creates a tournament, right? So now he's the alpha dog, but he doesn't have a lot of experience. So what does he do? He creates a rule set off his imagination, just, I'm going to do this. I mean, almost all of them really, like very few. I can't even think of a rule set was created by someone that's very experienced. A lot of times there are people who train, like the IBJJF guys all trained, they still train every now and then, but man, they're like 50 something now. Like they've been removed from the competition scene. They've turned into bureaucrats. Same thing happened to judo. People making decisions in judo, they're all older.
Yeah.
They don't let young people make decisions in judo. That hierarchy, like I think we should listen to young people. I don't think they're the wisest, but in terms of technique, they're ahead of everyone else. Like you want to learn good technique, you pay attention to what a 22-year-old is saying. Wisdom for life? Absolutely not. Right? Listen to Gordon. Every time Gordon says, "I'm just mouth," it's something incredibly stupid, right? But as far as technique goes, absolutely listen to him, because he has a lot to say there. Because there's something about youth that makes your mind highly creative and malleable. And I feel that I've lost this over time. Like my mind is less creative than it used to be. And it's not. I mean, for the same reason older people can't learn languages. I think it's something similar that's going on in the brain. Like it's hard to learn new things when you get older. Mm-hmm. But these rule sets, they're created by people that don't understand the sport. Like if I were to create a federation, I would put together the leading competitors, the young guys, the 22-year-olds, and I'd put them in a room and like, guys, let's think this intelligently, okay, for future generations. The problem with them is that they tend to be biased towards their own. Like Helio didn't like points when he was fighting. When he's retired in 67, he has no problem with points. I think maybe if they're too young, that'd be a problem. Maybe people from my generation, when we just retired, you put me, Homo Bahao, because not retired, but like close to, like Cyborg, the guys are on their way out. And we sit down and we agree on a rule set for the future generations to battle at. I think that would be a better decision. We would come up with a better rule set because we're familiar enough with competition. We're close enough to we haven't stopped that long ago. And we're very familiar with the sport and the tournaments and what's happening. And we would want what's best for the sport with a complete vision of it. That makes sense? If you're too old to think it, you're going to look at a heel hook as suspicious because you don't understand it. So what we don't understand, we fear, right? So I don't know. Like if you look, I'm not going to mention events here, but pick your event. Think of the person who can make the rule set, and now find out if they have a lot of experience. They don't have a lot of experience. It's very little to none. Sometimes none. Sometimes they've never competed before, but they come up with a rule set. So they are less likely to be able to see blind spots. You see the problem?
Okay, I'm trying to think of look at Metamoris. I mean, that's a pushback, right, to your theory.
But yeah, but Metamoris, who came up with it? Was it Huron and Henner?
Halleck, right?
Halleck? Halleck's never competed. I'll give you more. Okay, that's we're mentioning names like ADCC. The Sheik came up with the rules, and I love the Sheik. He's changed my life, but he's never competed. You want another one?
Seth Daniels.
Seth Daniels, like IBJJF. I mean, they haven't competed in years. Eddie Bravo. Eddie Bravo competed very little. He does not have a wide experience competing. Who else? I mean, Kip from Naga. And I like these guys. I'm not trying to but they don't have a lot of competition experience. So and that's always been the case. It's like you get these guys who are like they're great. They're bureaucrats. They're great for the sport because we need them. Like we need people like Seth. We need people like the IBJJFs and the Eddies, great in marketing and all that. But we need these guys. But like I don't think they should be ahead of come up with the rules because they don't see that far ahead. Like I called the submission only. People are going to butt scoot and fight for heel hooks and not fight for takedowns in top position. I called that when it first started. That's what's going to happen. Because how do you know it's going to be? Because that's what I would do if I were to train for that rule set.
Yeah.
Because I know how to think like a competitor. I'm like, I'm going to get really good at escaping arm bars, really good at escaping the back, and why would I bother wrestling? Screw that. I'm just going to sit and attack heel hooks all day. It's exactly what they're doing. But it's easy to see because you're always going to lean towards the easiest, most comfortable, straight line route shortcut. Like you're not going to go the long run, man. You're not going to climb a hill if you got a shortcut. You go for the shortcut, of course.
Yeah, you're not going to climb stairs when you have an escalator.
Yeah, but that mountain is important because you can't be how can you call yourself a black belt if you can't take anyone down? That's just me, man. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I think old school, but you should have a fundamental understanding of how to fight. And IBJJF rules for all their problems, you have to hold someone down, score points, right? So you have to hold them down. So that's UFC. UFC is the same. It's pointless to take someone down unless you hold them down, right? So there are similarities to the point system in a real fight. The point system doesn't make it less real. It's supposed to like reinforce positions that would be dominant in a fight. Granted, there are many, many voids and little glitches there, 100%. But the idea of holding someone down to score points is not a bad one.
I mean, people talk about the applicability of jiu-jitsu in MMA, and then they use the number of MMA fighters that have jiu-jitsu as a background as their proof. I mean, there has to be something. I mean, that's a direct correlation, right? I mean, yourself included. But
the thing, if we're going to go down that route, it's wrestling is the most important one. I mean, wrestling, you have far more UFC champions coming from wrestling than any other style. Now, there's a number of reasons why that happens, and it's, we can talk about those reasons, but I think jiu-jitsu is drifting away from its martial art roots. Like I used to criticize Rickson a lot because he would say this when I was coming up, and it's because you don't know open guard sweeps. And now it's like, now that I can barely keep up with Paulo Miao, I find myself making the same argument, right? But there's some truth to it. Like, as much as I appreciate a Bolo, I think it's beautiful. I don't think it should be allowed. I think it's beautiful. I watched it. I mean, that's one of the most beautiful. It's like he's breakdancing, with someone on top of him, and it's just beautiful to watch. I appreciate it. I teach it. I think it's part of the curriculum. With that being said, it's a drift away from combat. You know, like a lot of lapel sweeps, same thing. You're going to hold someone in lapel in 50-50. And what's that going to do for you in combat? You know, like I like takedown, hold down, grind for the pass, fight for that rear naked, you know, hold them back down, take them down. Like that MMA approach is the most appealing aspect of the whole thing to me. You know, and I think that we're going to have less, like Rodolfo might be the last of the Mohicans. I used to say that Demian Maia was the last of the Mohicans. I think Rodolfo might be him. Maybe Gary Tonin. I think Gary Tonin's got a good shot at doing really well in MMA. He's got the right game for it. But we're going to see less and less of these guys winning.
I see. Like that. Okay. Last Mohicans, and in terms of BJJ representatives in MMA. Well, Ryan Hall.
Ryan Hall. Okay, so we got some guys, but Ryan's unusual. I think Ryan's like you can't. It's hard to replicate because he's so technical and he's so non-wrestling, and he's gotten that Imanari roll down to a science, man. He's like, it's a difficult guy to mimic. But you know, maybe a style like that would be more like I teach an MMA class. I show Imanari rolls all day. Ryan Hall is a huge reference for me and my students because he's the most original BJJ practitioner in all of MMA. In the history of the sport, really. I can't think of anyone from Jiu-Jitsu that's more original than Ryan Hall. He thought
what a compliment.
It's true. I can't think of anyone. Name me someone. Like, okay, Roger was incredible in Jiu-Jitsu. Did well in MMA. He didn't win everything, but he did well. But what was he doing that was original? Or Demian Maia. Demian Maia was sort of original on the fence. We had a lot in common, like a lot of the same. It's funny because like when I watched Demian fight, I knew what he was going to do next because we're very similar. We trained together, so we have similar stuff. I knew what he was going to do before he does it. But he had some cool stuff on the fence. But the vast majority of practitioners that come from Jiu-Jitsu to fight MMA, they don't have anything new to add to the equation. They're just doing the same things or trying. Most of MMA fighters, in fact, it's rare that you see someone original in MMA at all. There's not a lot of original. Really, MMA is like remarkably similar to what it was 10 years ago. BJJ is advancing rapidly. MMA doesn't. And it has to do with the culture too. But Ryan Hall's an exception. Like I think he's probably the one that actually, you know, was able to think outside the bubble, well beyond Imanari did it first, true, but he did it consistently, or does it consistently. And then he's not the most athletic guy. He can't wrestle, which he's like, I never thought someone from Jiu-Jitsu would be good at MMA if you can't wrestle. You know, you proved me wrong.
If you could make a Jiu-Jitsu rule set from scratch, like you're on a new planet that's never heard of Jiu-Jitsu, and they say, King Drysdale, please.
Dictatorial powers.
Yes.
I love it. I love this world.
What rule set would you employ?
Very good. I would have I would use as a foundation before anyone crucifies me. Here, let me finish. I would use a foundation IBJJF. I would just modify a lot of it. I would reward points over submissions over position. Sorry. So I would have like a 2-to-1 ratio, like 2 points position, submission to 1 point position, or 3-to-1, or, you know, something of that nature, right? Maybe 3 points for submissions and 2 for mount and back, and then 1 for everything else. I would reward reversals. Reversals would all be 1 point, same as a sweep. So if I bridge you over from mount or from side control or from turtle, if I reverse you telly style, that's points. Same as a sweep. I would award advantage only for submissions. Near submissions only get advantage. If you almost pass or almost take me down, you don't get an advantage. If you almost submit me, you get an advantage. Or we can call it a point too. There are different ways we can do this. I would penalize guard pulling. Guard pulling will be a -1 because you're disengaging from standing. And it will be a way of forcing people to learn stand-up, right? ACB had that for the first minute. It was beautiful. I loved it. I wish they kept it the whole fight, but you'd be penalized if you pulled the first minute. What else? I think that'd be it. And then the other stuff, like as far as like going out of bounds, like the protocol, I think IBJJF does a really good job there. Where they err, in my opinion, is the heel hooks. I'd make heel hook legal for gi and no gi. But what IBJJF errs, in my opinion, is they are at the advantage. It's become overly tactical, and I think it's because of the advantages and them. It makes competitors prioritize position over submission, and that's a problem. It's not so much with the criteria. The criteria aren't bad. It's the reward system that makes people fight the way they fight, right? And then you have to reverse that reward system. People will be far more aggressive because it would make sense tactically for you to be more aggressive. Right now, it doesn't make a lot of sense for you. You can wrap some up in a 50-50 with lapel and hold them forever. you know, and you can't get penalized. It's like, man, like, of course that's what they're going to do. It works. It's easy. It's the shortcut. People are always going to go for the shortcut. Competitors are brilliant at finding the shortcuts. What a rule set has to do is eliminate all the shortcuts and make them climb the mountain, right? And that's their mistake. But like, as far as the protocol, I think they're on the right track. I mean, their tournaments look like the Olympics, man. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, but it's in that regard, I would mimic them to a T.
So in 1973, at least, I'm not seeing any guard pulls. I've only seen a handful of matches from the 90s, but like even then, it doesn't, you know, there isn't like aggressive guard pulling in the same way, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah.
I mean, were you taught to guard pull in the same way? Was it thought of as like a, you know, viable and attractive tool?
I mean, it's so odd to be inserted in this conversation because, like, to me, I don't see myself as old school. But when you say 98 in 2020, it sounds like old school as it gets.
Yeah.
When I started training, yeah, we pulled guard. I pulled guard all tournaments. I didn't start standing up until I got a black belt. Up to black belt, all I did was pull guard. Before that, I don't know. Like, you can see that there's. I mean, you have to ask it. I wish I'd asked these questions to the old timers we spoke to. These are good questions. Yeah, actually, you have some really good questions. I don't know when. Like, when I look at footage of Helio moving around, like, you know, he's moving like a judoka. But at the same time, you know, when he fought them, he closed the guard on them, right? Like, that's how he fought. Like, he closed the guard. I'm like, stay here. Like, that was his whole strike. He had a really good closed guard. So I suspect that he wasn't pulling guard, but when he got taken down, like, he was very comfortable inside closed guard. He had a good shot at win. That's how he beat Kato. He gets taken down, and then he closed the guard and finishes. Right? With the first one was a draw because he couldn't finish. So it was a draw or I win because if you saw my closed guard, I got a good closed guard. Helio liked the closed guard. That was his position. Right? So, you know, I think that they just drifted towards what they were good at. But can't think of a moment where they're actually teaching pulling guard. I don't know when that moment would be. It certainly happened. I agree with you. Like, the old school, like some of the old school guys, they stood up more. There was more standing and guard pulling. Like, I can't think. I don't know if competitions what they were like in the 70s and 80s. I wish I could watch footage. It'd be interesting. You know, that guy Paquetá, he's a Carlson Gracie black belt. He has a treasure trove of VHS tapes. I've tried to buy my fights from him. He was older. He was like so much. He didn't even care to look for him. I'm like, these are the tournaments I'm in. I'm like, please buy that footage. I'll pay double the price. He didn't care. But like, someone has that footage somewhere, and it'd be interesting to see how they were grappling. But I suspect that you're right. That wasn't that more guard pulling. I think guard pulling was something that evolved. It became more and more prominent in jiu-jitsu over time.